And so we had better recommence with something of a reminder of what we've seen. So on that note, just remind you that it began with Lucy in Narnia, unaware of the import of what it means to be human in that world. And we began with that thought because I believe Lewis wrote that story from the conviction that we so often have the very same. We enter this world not through a wardrobe, but through a womb of our mother. Just like Lucy, we walk around in it with seemingly so often no sense of gravity and the value of what it is that we are. And so we so desperately need to discover that. And so if we want to know the wonder of being human, then we need to know what it means to be made in the image of God. But that wasn't the only reason we needed to know the meaning of this doctrine. And that's what the first chapter was about, the image of God in Colossians. Their argument from the Apostle Paul was, if you don't know what the image of God means, then it's going to be impossible for us to know what it means for Christ to be the image of God. And if we don't know what it means for Christ to be the image of God, then we won't know, according to Paul, the one great thing in the Christian life that we need to know. We won't know this one, we won't see this one pole star, as it were, that will carry us through anything. And so those were basically the two arguments from the Bible thus far, meant to motivate us to find the treasure of meaning in what does it mean to be human? It means to be made in the image of God. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Only if we know that will we know the wonder of what it means to be the creature that we are. And only if we know that will we know what it means for Christ to be the image of God and have a post to hang on to in any wind. So if you have any Christian pulse at all, you are very much desirous to figure out what this means. So we dove in chapter 2 to discover that. The purpose of the image of God in man, that's the title of chapter 2, is to discover what it is, to at least set forth a thesis to get us going. And first thing we established, you may remember, was several whatever it means statements. There were 8 of them, to be exact. And these functioned as non-negotiables. These functioned as already understood, clear, scripturally laid down truths about the image of God. And therefore, whatever answer we bubble in, it must be consistent with these 8 statements of truth about this doctrine. Then after that, after establishing those, we immediately began to draw some inferences based on those. Namely, we excluded 14 common ideas of what the image of God is, because they are in one way or another inconsistent with the 8 things we know have to be true. And now, having done all of that, God is, and you to consider it. That process begins today. So my thesis is the image of God is the ruler for God. My argument is derived from Genesis chapter 1. So if you turn to Genesis chapter 1, my first premise, major premise of my argument, is found in Genesis 1, the first 25 verses. When you read these verses, you'll read of many things, but one plain thing you will see them teaching is that the ruler of the world is God. So I like the old saying from Alistair Begg that in the Bible, the main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. So we are not talking about, now this doctrine is deep, but seeing it in the Bible does not take deep thought. That's what I'm saying. You can, it has a shallow end and a deep end. So once you get in, you can explore it. But anyone can see of all that is said in these first 25 verses, surely one doctrine being communicated is God is the Lord of the world. For if whatever you say goes in a certain realm, you are evidently Lord of that realm. And clearly, the Bible presents to us whatever God says to the atoms and molecules and matter and energy goes. So he is Lord over it. And so that's premise number one. I derived that from the first 25 verses. The ruler of the world is God. That doctrine is my first premise. Premise number two of my argument, the minor premise, is from Genesis 1, 26 to 31. Again, when you read these verses, you will read of many things that are very interesting, but one main obvious thing you will see them teaching is that man was made to be the ruler of the world. Again, if you are commissioned by proper authority, and it's by God, so it's proper, it is his rule to delegate. If you're commissioned to rule over everything, then you're the ruler. Man is commissioned to rule over everything. Therefore, he is made to be the ruler of the world. So what I do is, in my argument, I take the first premise, the ruler of the world is God, from first 25 verses, set that down. Take the second premise, man was made to be the ruler of God, of the world, put that down. What's the conclusion? Therefore, man is the image of God. And I accentuate, in the book I would italicize it, but in a speech I would accentuate the therefore and say, therefore, man is the image of God, in order to convey the reason he's called the image is because of the analogy of rule. For example, excuse my voice, apologies. But suppose I wanted to argue for the thesis that apples are foods. And then I told you my argument was fruits are foods, apples are fruits, therefore apples are foods. The reason I would be asserting that apples are foods is because they're fruit. And in the same way, to say the Lord of the world is God, man is made to be the Lord of the world, therefore he is the image of God, is precisely, I mean to say, the reason and the only reason man is particularly called the image is because he is the Lord of the world as God is. So, what Genesis 1 presents is, if you flow with it, in the first 25 verses, God rules over the world to start with. But from verse 26 onward, man's task is to finish the divine rule, to finish what God has started. That's the calling. That's what we're called to do. To put it another way, the human project is to finish the divine project so that there will be an accurate image of God. And let me elaborate now, set forth the thesis and the argument. Despite all differences between man and God, this is the one respect in which man is uniquely similar to God. Despite all the similarities between man and animals or man and angels, this is the one respect in which man is utterly different and distinct from all those other creatures. This and this alone is why you matter. This fact, not your eyes, not the shape of your head, not your physical body, not your morality, not your reason, not your spirit, not any of the other 14 things. You cannot see it in the mirror when you look in the glass as you're brushing your teeth tonight. That is not the basis of your value. Your value, you already see the message of grace at the beginning, comes outside of you, toward you, and is put upon you by God. You matter because you matter to God. You're the number one creature to Him. You want to get an analogy of it, you think of, I used to have when I was a teenager, this ring that was hanging from my rearview mirror. It looked just like a regular little silver ring, and it wasn't even that good looking of a ring. And so if you saw it, you'd be like, why is this ring hanging here? Well, the reason is my grandmother, who died of cancer when I was 14, gave it to me. That's why it mattered to me. Similarly, it's not your beauty. It's not, do you have all your legs or not? It's not, are you as pretty as this person? Are you as athletic as this person? It's the fact that God put you on this particular species among really comes from outside. So we meet at the very beginning. So as God ruled over the world, so He made man to rule over the world in His place as His substitute, as His representative, as His mediating presence on earth. His immanence. Man is the immanent presence of God on earth. Therefore, you're starting to get a feel for like why Jesus would be the mediator. It's not abnormal at all, but that's later on. Therefore, the image of God is the ruler for God, and the ruler for God is man. So, man is made to rule in God's place and manifest His redemptive presence on earth. So, in terms of the classic communicable and incommunicable attributes of God, what I'm saying is the attribute of God that's being communicated through man, which is not communicated through any other creature, is lordship. Or you could call it sovereignty. Or you could call it dominion. Or kingship. Or rule. Man is the image of the redemptive rule of God on earth. Now, turn to Hebrews 2, and we can state this even more richly. If I were to say that as the whole entire world is subject to a dependent relationship with God, so that everything either falls apart or comes together based on the decision of God, so also the entire world has been subjected, Romans 8, to a dependent relationship with man, so that everything will fall apart or come together based on the decisions of man. Squirrels, trees, oceans, it all will come together in a way that is good or fall apart in a way that is evil based on humanity. Again, you can look forward and see what Jesus meant when he said on the tree, behold, I make all things new. He was not doing something abnormal. He was fulfilling our telos as humans. So if the real world were a Marvel movie, man is the one who wears the glove containing all the infinity stones, and it is his finger snap that determines the destiny of everything. So that in this way he becomes an image of God. Now, if this sounds fantastic, and no doubt it does, consider that the author of Hebrews, as you look in Hebrews 2, teaches exactly what I just told you. Says in Hebrews 2, verses 5 to 8, for he, that is God, did not subject to angels the world to come, concerning which we're speaking. That one has testified somewhere, and I quote Psalm 8, remember him, or the Son of Man, they were concerned about him. I hope you see the graciousness in Genesis chapter 1 from the very beginning. Grace of God doesn't just show up in redemption. The grace of God shows up in the very initiation of creation. It is out of his bounty and benevolence, his unearned benevolence, that he even was concerned with anything outside of his own being. It cannot be coerced. It cannot be manipulated. It doesn't need anything. So his dealings with us are free and gracious and out of his overflow. And man, the very rhetoric here assumes that man is the unlikeliest creature of all to be exalted. The very rhetoric assumes the tropes that you see in Tolkien and Lewis of little hobbits ruling the world, little children being made kings and queens. So he says, you have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor and have appointed him over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. And then he comments, for in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. But we do not yet see all things subjected to him. First of all, I want you to notice here in Mark that the author uses the familiar phrase to all Bible readers. It was in the song we were just singing, all things. Anyone with any experience reading the Bible knows that phrase. Romans 11:36, from him, through him, and to him are all things. Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for good. Philippians, I can do all things. 1 Corinthians 13, hope in all things, believes all things. So all things, we know, is a reference to the entire created order. Additionally, notice he uses the word world. He did not subject the world to angels, but to him. So that's another term for the entire created order. So it's clear that's what he's talking about. Fantastic as it may sound, that's what he's talking about. Next, I invite you to notice that the author affirms that all things were subjected to, quote, him. And I invite you to reflect on who is the antecedent to that pronoun. And I invite you to notice it is not Jesus specifically, but mankind generally. The beginning of the quote of Psalm 8, what is man that you remember him? The antecedent is man, which is the general term for humanity. to be clear, Jesus fulfills that, but I'm wanting you to see the logic of him fulfilling it is that there was a prior purpose with regard to the human flesh that he took on in the incarnation. That is the logic of the incarnation. He takes on flesh because of God's purpose for human flesh. Next, the author then flat out affirms that all things were subject to man. Saying the same thing from another angle, he even denies that there is any created thing that is not subject to him. For he says, in subjecting all things to him, and remember, this means man, he says he left nothing that is not subject to him. This means the author of Hebrews is reading Genesis 1 the same way the author of Psalm 8 is reading Genesis 1, which is the same way I am reading Genesis 1, which is the same way I'm suggesting you ought to read Genesis 1, namely as teaching that man was called to rule over all things in order to finish the divine project so that we would experience an image of God. That is the human calling. That is why you're breathing. That is why we're here. That is what I'm inviting you to believe. That is our ultimate purpose. So, in another way, still, as the one ruler over all things is God, so man was made to be the one ruler over all things. Therefore, he is the image of God. We may even also note how the author excludes angels here. Someone asked a great question in one of the earlier sermons on chapter 2. How do we know that the angels are not made in the image of God? There's a couple answers to that. One is he says, let us make man in our image. The angels didn't create us, but the us did create us, which is the bringing out of the plural in the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, which is plural. There's a fullness in the monotony, which is explicated in the Trinity revelation of the New Testament. But the other would be Hebrews 2, right? He says this kind of rule was not given to angels. So I believe angels do exercise dominions. I believe in the medieval idea that there might be angels in the sun. There might be angels. When you get to the bottom of matter and energy, angels might be making the wind blow. So the real world is a lot more magical than the Enlightenment rationalism you've inherited has taught you to think. So I think there might be domains, dominions, angels probably rule. There's some evidence in Daniel, they rule over nations. And so all of that might be true, but none of them have the extent and the realm of rule that goes all the way to the boundary of all things. Their actions don't affect all the way into eternity in their rippling, like the actions of Adam and Christ. So that is why, even though they are similar to us in many respects, they are not the image of God. So get this, only one creature is given the relationship of supreme importance to the entire rest of creation so that his decisions will ripple out into eternity. This means man is weighty to the world in the same way that God is weighty to the world. When you start hearing about the sovereignty of God and salvation, you feel the weight of God and the glory of God. That I remember rocking Annabelle when she was a baby, like a little smaller than Leo back there and rocking her to sleep at night, wondering if God chose her or not. And having people try to save me from that thought, oh, don't think God is free to elect some and reprobate others, and he does no wrong to anyone. Some get justice, some get mercy, none get injustice. And that means, though I'm a Christian dad, it was a possibility that he would pass over her and leave her in her sin. And that is why in those early days, there were instances of me laying on the floor, gut-busting tears, not trying to plead with God to save her, but in awe of the gravity of God. That doctrine is meant to humble us in the dust before him, that he is God, that he has mercy on whom he desires. That is something of the weightiness of God. Well, Paul says man is the image and glory of God in 1 Corinthians 11:7. This means like there's a weight to man that parallels the weight of God. The glory, this is the sway of man, the shadow that he cast in the community, the weightiness of his decisions affecting everything. Man has that kind of relationship to the rest of the earth. He wears this unique crown. Moreover, we might even note author of Hebrews in Psalm 8 and Genesis 1's usage of the familiar ancient Near Eastern colloquialism, under feet. And Joshua tells other Hebrew leaders to come over and to put their feet on the necks of the enemies that they just conquered. This is a colloquial expression of the enemies that they just conquered. This is a colloquial expression of dominion, of subjugation. You say, on top of my work. And by which we mean we just have it under control. We have a command of it. But remember, the psalmist says God has put all things under man's feet. So imagine saying, I'm on top of all things. I have total control over all things. I have dominion over all things. This is the authority and control that God's given to man. And I hope your mind is running to the Gospels now and seeing how unextraordinary it is for Jesus to command the winds and the waves and all the diseases, to have authority over all things. A helpful illustration of this, by the way, I didn't get this from the trip this time. I wrote this chapter previously, but you knew there would be a Disney illustration in here somewhere. One of the early shows. And in this story, it's the one of the hat, the blue hat with the star and the moon on it. So in this story, there is this magician or wizard, if you will, and he has a magic pointed blue hat. And upon his hat, as I said, a symbol of the stars and a moon, apparently meant to express that this hat gives one cosmic powers. Now, what happens in the story is Mickey's just an apprentice to this magician, but one day, after the wizard performs some feats of power, he sets his hat on the table and goes up to bed, and Mickey does, well, a very Mickey thing. he goes over and takes the hat, puts it on his head, and tries it out a bit to see if he can do some things. And lo and behold, it works. And by the time the story gets going, I mean, he's commanding the waves and the ocean and pointing the stars where to go. He has the same powers because he wears the same hat. And he is ruling over all these things just as the magician. And in the same way, the Bible is telling us that in the beginning, God, when the psalm says he crowned him with glory, he put the ruler's hat, the wizard's hat, on man. This is why over 600 million people want to read about Harry Potter. This one. God made man to rule over the matter. It's just an archetypical idea. And so even if the church isn't preaching it, like regular people out there are hungry for this doctrine. And they found it in that fictional story. Even if they don't understand, Paul says you worship what you do not know. And the Christmas song says, come desire of nations, come. The irony of a lost image of God is he subconsciously seeks the Lord while not consciously seeking it. Because he seeks all those things that can only be found in him. He cannot unbe what he is. So long as God functions as the backstop and keeps reality, that doesn't allow it to completely disintegrate and keeps us who we are, he'll still act it out some. He'll still try to rule over the matter. He'll still build something. He'll still feed the animal. He'll still take care of the chickens. He'll still check on someone. He'll still give some medicine in the IV. That is man ruling over the matter. That is man being a human, being what he's made to be in some degree due to common grace. So the psalm says he's crowned man with the ruler's hat. He's gave him the glory and honor of being the ruler over all things. So man will wear the hat with the stars and the moon on it and be the Lord of the whole entire world, even though he seems to be a nobody and unfit for it. So, as Mickey was an image of the wizard, because he donned the ruler's hat and ruled over all things like the wizard, what I'm saying is man is an image of God because it's been given to him to don the ruler's hat and rule over all things like God. To be sure, again, to emphasize, I'm saying this and this alone is the attribute that makes us special. So 2 final remarks and then we'll close for today. I want to make one remark on man being a ruler for God, that word for, and then man being a good world ruler for God. So first, by for God, I mean substitution language here. So I mean man is meant to be the ruler in the place of God. In the same way that we say Christ died for me, we mean as my substitute. So when I say the image of God is the ruler for God, I mean the ruler that rules in God's place as God's substitute. He's his image. And that ruler is man. And therefore he's the image. So you might think of just as some students are told sometime, something like, I know the teacher of this class, maybe a principal comes in, assistant principal, and they say, I know the teacher of this class is Miss Smith, but today you'll have Miss Jones because we have a substitute teacher today. In the same way, all of creation is given its God, the Lord God. He's the ruler over all things, that he is determined to give the world a substitute ruler. so that there can be an image of God who is transcendent and abstract and incorporeal and invisible, whom no man can see. And so we don't really know what it looks like for there to be one thing causing all things to work together for good. I mean, we can see all the parts, but we can't see the unity, the unifier. We can't see the conductor of the choir. And by the way, now, Romans 8 says, which brings me to the word good, what we essentially see now is creation, the choir of creation, grinding on in disharmony because the substitute ruler has been such a bad ruler and has fallen. The one who's called to govern is himself ungoverned. Such a wonderful concept. It makes the incarnation of Christ so beautiful that is what he's meant to come and recover. So, as Joseph was made vice regent and ruler for Pharaoh over all of Egypt, just a little lower than Pharaoh in authority, so man was made to be the vice regent and ruler for God over all the world, second only to God. By good world ruler for God, I mean he was not just made to rule as though it's like, well, be Scar, that's fine, you can just rule over Pride Rock like Scar. No, it's more like Simba, you're made to rule in Mufasa's place as he would rule, so that we have an image of Mufasa, even though we're not looking at Mufasa. That's the goal. And so you see that in the beginning. Every step of the way, God's rule is called good, manipulating the matter for good. And so that's what we're called to do, not just rule and domineer one another for selfish ends, but to learn about creation and to be holy and to get the Spirit given to us and to put all that together to redeem everything and rule it just as God ruled it, such that everything we do, give you saying, and we move this and this, and it was good. And we did this in the marriage, and it was good. And somebody was struggling with assurance, and the pastor came, and he shared this thought and this thought, and it was good. And somebody was sick, and they come to the doctor, and somebody figured out their magnesium level and gave them a supplement, and it was good. I want you to see that the human project is wider than this current room we're in. And Lord knows there needs to be more wonderful, godly, helpful preachers on earth. But you should not think this is the only sacred calling. It's a terrible idea. There needs to be wonderful botanists on earth and biologists on earth and doctors on earth and teachers and coaches. And wherever you can find things that are fallen, that you can begin to be a redeemer to them, go do it. And that's why we should not be thinking like, oh, well, what happened to our dear brother that many of us love? Or even when you're looking at me at this moment, because I happen to be standing up here preaching, I'm just a vapor who's here today, gone tomorrow. I have my own little part to play, but what we're called to do as humans cannot be done if we're all gathered around one man. That's not what we're to do. Like, I can't minister in Africa right now, so there needs to be brothers and sisters in Africa who know the truth and are gathering those people. And telling them the truth. It's not a one-man project. So we shouldn't even want all the attention on us. It's counter to the project. It says David served the purpose of God in his generation, and then he fell asleep. That's the goal. See how helpful this is? Like, is my life a success? And am I reaching my goals? And am I a failure? Or shall I be depressed or not, or whatever? It all depends on what is your calling. Your calling when you get married is that when it's finished, your spouse is better as a result of being your spouse. More has been redeemed. There, your calling and having children, you're going to fail them. But is your progeny further along than where you were? See, this helps with generation. Like, we look back, younger generations tend to look back on like their parents and be like, well, Dad didn't even know Calvinism. Well, it's like John Adams, he's like, look, I need to study politics. And he goes through his descendants, and you get to like the fifth one, and he says they're going to be studying, what does he say, like pottery or something, like porcelain. That's what. So he's like, I need to study politics so that my sons can study, math, and they need to study that so that their sons can study science, and they need to study that so that their sons can do something with porcelain. It's like when we're in a war, we don't have time to do anything with porcelain, but break it and cut people with it. And so instead, what we ought to be thankful for is, man, I think my parents took me to church. Okay? So I sat and I heard whatever degree of truth I heard. Do you realize the grace that is? To even be hearing of Christ and Him crucified, to have another man like Jim Spencer when I was a little boy, be just every Sunday pleading to come to Christ, and He's the answer for everything, and bring all your burdens, and to be able to talk to that man and just feel the warmth, and you just, yes, come in. There's grace, and that does something to your brain and your psyche and your soul that people who never hear of this don't get. And so you might say, well, I didn't see the Calvinism there. Well, no, I didn't. But the future generation is going to look at me and was like, well, wasn't really the right schooling. There's going to be something that I'm deficient in. So if you see the big project, what we're really supposed to be doing is making progress toward the final goal of new creation. And the question then becomes not what is wrong with this Christian's life, but rather what is right about it. What did they get right? And then to build on that. And that's it, to fall asleep like that, to move the ball forward and die and say, now, passing it on to y'all, and I'm just going to lay here and sleep and wait on the final day. And so just write over my tombstone, Psalm 16:1, preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you, and fall asleep and wait. That was the spirit of Joseph. Take my bones up. God will surely visit you. That is a wonderful ending. None of that was in the notes. It's just me talking about this because I've been thinking about it so much. It's so important. So, in conclusion, man was made to be the world ruler for God, and he was made to be a good world ruler for God, so that through his rule, all of creation would experience the ultimate image of God. And we would see that it is good for all that is beautiful to depend on God. That's why we exist. And when we see one day everything is in a beautiful flow and shape, all of the atoms are moving in a way that is good, all of the energy transfers are good, and we see that all people are smiling, laughing, children playing in the streets, there's no longer any crying or pain or arguments in this restoration of all things. And then to draw the line back and say, and it's all a result of the one hanging on the tree. Then we will know something of what it's like to be God. Because he is the one thing that causes all things to come together in a way that is good. And that's what we see through the man Christ Jesus on the cross. That in that kind of love, he does this. So that you're not just looking abstract, like you have a one to look at that is causing it. So this means, finish with this means the image of God is both a fact and an act. It is I'm going to put it this way. This is why, as a result of the fall, it can be said to be diminished, and yet it remains. As for the fact that man holds this position in relationship to the world, that does not change. He is always, as a fact, the appointed ruler and the dominator of all things. But as for the act, in the sense, does he fulfill it in a way that is good? To this he fell short. And that is what's being redeemed in Christian salvation. So, man is told both that he is the image of God and he is called to become the image of God. He is told that he is human and he is told to become human. Think of that. Because what it means to be human is to be the image, and we're not yet the image. And so we're still called to be human. Be normal. And that means redeem everything. It's the most normal thing you could ever do. Quit being weird. Rule over all things. You're like a guitar that someone's shooting an arrow. Like, use your being the right way. You're meant to play a song, not shoot arrows. It doesn't work. That's why you cry and you're upset and all your idols disappoint. You're doing the wrong thing. And then it's like, look at Christ. He's the one human. Look at his resurrected body. I mean, what do you see matter and energy doing in him? It's totally like, look at that. Don't you believe in the resurrection? I mean, what else do you call that? And healing people, what is that? Other than ruling over all things. And so what we're called to do is, going way off script, but what we're called to do is, it's like Jesus is the one human that's actually running the ball toward the end zone. And the gospel good news is like, and get this, even though you've screwed everything up, so that you like have Adam Sandler looking at you saying, you blew it. God says, that's okay. You're still on my team. And here's Jesus. Just go get behind him and rush and everybody all at one push, try to push the ball across the end zone. And don't get hung up in like, well, what eschatology? Don't worry about all that. Just know this is what you're calling to figure all those maps out. Goodness, I got enough to do with my time. Well, what about the second toe of I don't have time for that. I have to cook and serve hamburgers and stuff. Like, goodness, the burden we put on people. The main things are the plain things. And the plain things are the main thing. And this is the plain thing. The human project, which is our whole purpose on earth, is to realize who we are and then become who we are. And our goal is to fully become human, to fully become normal. Human nature is a seed that is meant to evolve until it reaches its full bloom. And all of nature is waiting for that revealing and growing in childbirth, for that revealing of the sons of God. So this is what it means to be and to become human, but more on that later. I've already gone on so far, so I won't include the rest of this. I'll just say this, that there is one last thing standing in the way of this thesis. You may be one that already has raised it in your mind. It's a very specific question about the text of Genesis chapter 1. And since I've appealed to Genesis chapter 1 for support, and since it's a good question, it must be answered. If it can be answered, then the thesis will stand and we can go ahead and pour in the concrete around the post. If it can't be answered, well, best thing it can do is wobble there like another good opinion on what the image of God might be. And whether it will stand or fall, we don't have any more time to go on today, so that'll begin next time in the next chapter, and that's why the next chapter is called The Image of God in Genesis. But I do pray that even in this sermon, you've got something of a fresher view of the beauty of life and what it is that you're called to do and to be and to become, and that involves much more than this that we're doing here. This is important. It's very important. It has its place. But so does hammering nails, cutting boards, cooking food. Remember the first thing Jesus did after he was risen from the dead? It's like, what would you do? You're completely full of the Spirit. We talk about, well, if I were full of the Spirit. He folded clothes. That was his first thing to do. So remember that next time you're folding laundry. Very spiritual. Bringing about an order that is good. Like some of you, I always think of Jen when I think just the creativity. I mean, Bodie has this thing where he gets into the cultural mandate. He's another good one on it. It's like when you build a bridge, you come across a ravine or something, a creek, and you're like, well, we got to build a bridge. And there's two approaches. It's like one approach is, well, let's just throw a rope over and we get to the other side, and well, you think, should we go up and just leave it there is fine. And then the next people come and then they fall. So it's like dominion and creativity overall. No, don't just build it sturdy. Learn some geometry, right? Learn some math, do some figuring, and learn about the earth and the mud and the depth and the layering of the dirt here and how to set all this. And then he goes further and he's like, and then after you get the bridge, like do some carvings in it. You think, carvings? What does that do to you when you cross a bridge and it's not even about function? It's not like a carved bridge is better than the function is not the point. When you read Genesis, there's different kinds of trees, right? There's trees that are for food, and there's trees just for the eyes. Just because they're beautiful. I mean, what does a woman do? She makes a room for the child. It's like, oh, well, all we need is manila walls and a cot. Well, no. Man, there's little quotes, and here's dad and mom picture, and everything is just decorated in a way to communicate you matter. And so what I'm trying to get across is human beings are sometimes depressed and so lost that when someone is hospitable to them, not just in a sermon, are they redeemed, but when someone is hospitable to them and the way they treat them, that might be the thing that makes them feel like, maybe I do matter. And therefore, that is spiritual. And some people get offended at this, but just as important, or maybe even more important than what I'm doing right now. It might be more important. So, we need to produce better buildings. We need people to go into art. We need people to go into like how to do stainless glass and just all like our children, our descendants need to do the porcelain. Why? Because we want people to know they matter. Do you know Vodi said in Africa, because he goes there, there are no sidewalks. There are no concrete sidewalks. There's not even any asphalt. You're just driving on dirt. There's not even a light at the intersection. At night, when you go to 2 a.m, just people, they're doing the regular thing when the power's out. And Vodia said, because he's traveled the world, he's like, you know what, sidewalks are a Western invention. Why do we have sidewalks? Because man is made in the image of God and he matters, and we communicate that he matters by giving him a sidewalk. There's so many things in our culture like this. The strips on the road. Do you see? You could be a worker just running this thing with full purpose just as much as Stephen Lawson. In obscurity, because you don't even know what the Lord is going to use this strip for. But you're doing it because how many lives will be saved? And what will go on and become of those lives? And you're so aligned with your ultimate purpose. And so, children, some of you, please go into the ministry. Some of you, just go out into the world and redeem it. Go talk to your friends and why are you sad and what is wrong? Become a psychologist so that you can understand it. I don't have time. And in one of my other 8 lives, I thought I would like to be a psychologist. But I only have one life. So enjoy the Lord and just find something to put your hand to that you feel like you can do with anything. Anything. I'll stop. Amen.